Greetings, dear viewers, ladies and gentlemen. I've got you a special guest, and he is Rasmus Sonderriis. He's a Danish writer and journalist. We're going to talk about current issues unfolding in Ethiopia. So do stay with us. This is our weekly Addis Dialogue with the program. I'm Shifaralaka. Thank you for joining us. Rasmus, thank you so much for being with me.
No, thank you very much. It's a great honor. I've followed many of your shows. So you have had so many luminaries on your show, Friends of Ethiopia and Ethiopians. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you are following things happening in Ethiopia, especially, when it comes to the conflict in the northern part of the country. You've also written articles about Ethiopia and why the whole Western response to the conflict in Ethiopia has been so wrong-headed. So tell me first a little bit about that, and we'll continue our discussion.
Right. So the wrongheadedness springs from our own belief in peace through strength, right? In our own countries, we keep the peace through strength, state monopoly on violence. But in Ethiopia, or perhaps in all of African countries, unless Islamists are involved or something that makes it easier for us to relate to give a framing to the conflict, the formula is, the peace through pacifist sermons, peace through finger wagging, as if Africans were not fighting for anything worthy of fighting for, So our policymakers will say there's no military solution, so we should negotiate, power sharing with, in this case, an ethno-nationalist militia. And this is wrong-headed because it undermines democracy building and it encourages warlordism. And I think this springs from generalizations about African wars. And I just want to give a perfect illustration of this. I think it was when Biden sent one of his many envoys to Addis Ababa, Jeffrey Feltman, back in November, when TPLF was marching on the capital and everybody was scared that there would be a bloodbath. And he said three things that when you put them together, you think, oh, it couldn't be more wrong-headed, right? This is the epitome of wrong-headedness. He said, Ethiopia is a democracy. Great, he's recognizing it. It's an imperfect one. It's being built, but he recognized Ethiopia as a democracy. And then he said, Ethiopian will fight tooth and nail against TPLF if they go into Addis Ababa. So he even used the word bloodbath situation, right? And then he said like 4 or 5 times, the United States does not take sides. So really, if you put it together, what is that United States would not take side in favor of a fellow democracy against those out to commit a bloodbath in its capital. I mean, it's outrageous. If you'd said that in Ukraine, everybody would have been scandalized. But here, it just passed as something normal, Yeah. I mean, there was no outraged editorials in any newspaper. And the irony is, actually, everybody assumed that the United States had taken sides, but in favor of the TPLF, in favor of those out to commit a bloodbath. So, yeah, that seems to me to be the epitome of wrong-headedness.
Okay, thank you. Let's also come to the current situation happening in Ethiopia. As I'm sure you have been following, Ethiopians have been waging huge rallies across the country, clearly denouncing the intervention of the West against this sovereign state. What kind of message can these rallies convey in your view?
Right. So I participated in one of those rallies last November in Copenhagen. So, and I find that when we speak to the Western public, we can change minds with positive messaging, like support our democracy, respect our constitutional order, let our own newly independent human rights organizations do their work, free Tigray from the TPLF. Those kind of messages work very well. But the whole thing about the West seeing Ethiopia and not TPLF as the villain, it's been so frustrating and infuriating. I mean, to be honest, if I hadn't been able to write about it, it would have driven me insane. So I can imagine how infuriating it must be for Ethiopian to see their country smeared in that fashion. So I can understand the messages that go along the lines of hands off, stay out, keep away, But I don't think from a strategic viewpoint that's very useful, because let's face it, much of this springs from Ethiopia's image problem, right? It has an image problem. I wouldn't say it's all bad. It's not all bad. You have the best coffee in the world. I'm drinking some here. You have great athletes. You have very good-looking people, everybody says. But still, it's etched into pop culture that Ethiopia is the land of hopelessness, of famine and cruelty. And so the international media, they tend to latch on to that. So, this Nigerian author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she said, she's warned against the danger of the single story. And she said the problem with stereotypes is not necessarily that they aren't true, but that they're incomplete. So that's what I recommend. Try to tell the more positive stories about Ethiopia.
Moving on from there, Rasmus, the government of Ethiopia is already delivering humanitarian aid to areas that have been liberated by the Ethiopian National Defense Force, and the people are accepting it well. So I want to ask you this question as well. What is your observation here, as opposed to the TPLF terrorist group, which has been forcing them to give up at least one family member to serve as a rebel soldier?
Yeah, that's what the whole world wanted to see, isn't it? Including those who've been against Ethiopia, those who've been predicting doomsday. They should be especially relieved and happy to see this. They should want aid to flow into the areas under Ethiopian control. They should help out with that. Unless they prefer more to grind suffering to being proved wrong. You sometimes get that impression, but I don't want to accuse them of being malignant. But the fact that there's no genocide, there's no intention to make Tigrayans suffer. This is very damaging to TPLF's credibility, because the whole justification for running an irregular army, I mean, what can possibly justify running an irregular army? Only the genocide narrative can justify that. In that sense, it's a stroke of genius, because it's really the only way you can justify running an army against the democratic constitutional order, if you can make people believe that. Unfortunately, it's been, because of this image problem and media sensationalism, it's been very easy to paint Ethiopia as some kind of a disaster country, right? So, but now we're seeing also public services being restored by Ethiopians. We hope they won't be sabotaged by TPLF as they got last time, but that's a possibility. So, yeah, this will contradict the narrative. We just need to give it a little time. These people, they hate being proved wrong, so they will try to come up with something. But as time goes on, I think we will win the media battle. Mike Hammer, he understood that you cannot provide public services without security. I mean, that's the first public service you need to provide, is security. It's kind of the prerequisite for all the other public services, right? So he understood that, and he said it out loud. You need security before you can have all the other public services. And TPL was livid when he said it, So, Ethiopia was being asked to fix a mobile network in Mekelle, when its representatives were being paraded in the street as hostages. It's just absurd. But let's hope everything returns to normal in Tigray. That's what we all want, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what everybody wants, peace and prosperity in this East African nation. On the other hand, we're also seeing this circulating video that a whole warehouse of World Food Program and USAID had been feeding TPLF in the name of humanitarian aid. But the narrative has been, the other way around. So what lesson can this give to the international community?
The World Food Program and USAID have let themselves be used, right? I hope they're able to draw lessons from this. They should have insisted on handing out the food themselves, but because this repurposing of aid for war is something that costs Ethiopian lives. It's easy for the West not to care about, a few hundred trucks getting lost, 12 fuel trucks being stolen, because it doesn't make a lot of difference to them. But Ethiopians, they have to face those tanks with the fuel in them, and the soldiers transported in those trucks, they will kill Ethiopians. So the lesson is the international aid organizations, they need to respect Ethiopia's security challenges. And, there are many dilemmas. War and counterinsurgency are not easy. And I certainly, just to make that clear, I completely condemn war crimes on both sides. I want justice for war crimes on both sides, right? But I believe the West could have avoided a lot of bloodshed if they had supported Ethiopia morally, militarily, diplomatically, also militarily, and frozen TPLF's assets and played the role of the ally, of the democratic ally, instead of this infuriating sermonizer.
Yeah, I think you raised great point there. They should have been helping Ethiopia in every way possible. Yeah. But ironically, we're also witnessing leaders at the helm of global organizations such as the World Health Organization and Antonio Gutierrez clearly supporting TPLF. Should this be expected? Should we expect such a thing? Is this becoming of such people who are expected to lead the world equal? What is your observation here?
Well, unfortunately, Antonio Gutierrez, he only knows what he hears on the BBC and CNN, what he hears from Tedros. So, but Tedros, he sure knows Ethiopia, right? He's a master. He's a master at exploiting these racist stereotypes to his advantage. That's what he does. Very, very. I mean, you notice there are many stereotypes about Africans, but one that does not exist is that of the super psychopathic supervillain, right? You never see Hollywood star black guy as the super psychopathic supervillain. So what he plays, the role that he plays, is one that goes down very well. Is this the simple-minded, pacifist, innocent, noble victim, and it works like a charm. It's like they don't even check his record. Everybody is scared of facing him, especially because they will be accused of being genocide deniers, and nobody wants that, unless they know Ethiopia very well, like I do. Like I have lived in Ethiopia for so many years. I've followed the Ethiopian people's struggle to overcome the TPLF dictatorship. Otherwise, it's very scary to be accused of genocide, apology for genocide. So I think that's what's at play. But the terrible irony is that, he accuses others of racism. Tedros accuses others of racism, but what he does is distracting from the real racism, which is the inability to see through Tedros masquerading as this humanitarian angel, peace, love, compassion, when he's really that sneaky, cunning supervillain that nobody imagines. I think if he had been a white guy saying, waxing pacifist like that, saying, "Oh, we need peace," or we need peace, people would have been suspected something fishy, But he fits the role of the donor darling, the simple-minded, good-hearted chap. God bless him. It's unbelievable. It says a lot about the world that he can get away with it.
Let's also talk about Western nations, some Western nations, of course. Many say the cry of some in the West against Ethiopia is nothing more than, a requirement to impose their chosen government, their puppet government. Does this make any sense to you?
Yeah, I noticed you said some in the West. I think that's a very important qualification, because we must remember the West is not a single person with the same views, the same interests, right? It's a vast collection of different individuals with lots of different views and incentives. So yeah, for some, I'm sure there's some who want TPLF to get back in power, the people who are close to Tedros, or maybe who are close to Meles Zenawi, have a rosy view of that period. But no, it doesn't make sense at an overall level. I don't think it's not in the Western interest. I mean, for a start, the TPLF is just too hated to ever rule Ethiopia again. All they can do is plunge the country into chaos. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the US is finally beginning to realize that all they're gaining from this both sidism is becoming extremely unpopular. They're not even popular with the TPLF, right? They've just become unpopular all over the Horn of Africa. And I think also the Western diplomats, when they spend time in Ethiopia, they talk to a lot of Ethiopians, they start to take on the Ethiopian perspective. So, because Western governments, they don't want 120 million refugees. They want stability. Almost all people see themselves as good. I've worked a lot in development aid. They may be misguided in many ways, but they don't want Ethiopians to suffer. They want progress, democracy, human rights. The same thing as the Ethiopians that are my friends, the same Western ideals that Ethiopians share with most Westerners. So the problem is they have a wrong diagnosis of what this conflict is about. They're seeing it through a prejudiced lens, the infamous toxic white savior complex, that makes them think they're morally superior. Yeah, that's appalling. But, a lot of Ethiopians, then they will say to me, no, they're not, out to help us in any way. They just want to do us down so they can exploit us. I fully understand that perspective. I'm not going to split hairs over that. We're on the same side, because really it doesn't really matter. Is the West harming Ethiopia because of its disgusting moral superiority complex, or is the West harming Ethiopia because the West is bad? I don't think it makes such a big difference at this stage. So yeah, I think what matters is the West has stabbed Ethiopia in the back, but I also usually I say also the West has shot itself in the foot, you know. But perhaps just as we have in the West, we have stereotypes about Africans. Maybe the Africans also have stereotypes about Europeans. That's normal. And you know, you don't become rich and successful by shooting yourself in the foot. So it's hard for Africans to accept that the Europeans have botched it. They're completely messed up. But that's what I think, you know. But as I said, this is not something that should divide us. You know, you learn during a war that you have to get on with people with different political views.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to ask you this question. Do you personally believe that the West has betrayed Ethiopia?
Yes, I think the word betrayal is very well chosen here because it implies that you were expecting something different, right?
Yeah.
You know, so when this war began, I assumed naively that the West was going to support those in Ethiopia who support us. By that, I don't mean people who agree with every Western foreign policy, but you know, people who basically share our ideals of, you know, free markets, democracy, human rights, ethnic coexistence based on equality of opportunities. And the TPLF has a terrible record in all those fields. So I assume this. I want to make clear, I'm not a man of the far left, of the far right. I'm a moderate centrist, and so are all my Ethiopian friends, right? So that's why we all expected the West to be on our side, even if not the whole West can be as knowledgeable as us about the 27 years of TPLF misrule, you know. It's such an irony to see TPLF spokesperson banging on about human rights, and then the next breath they praise Meles Zenawi as this visionary, great leader. When he deported every Eritrean, for example, during that war, children and old people, stripped them of all their assets. Thank God nothing like that has happened to our fellow Tigrayan citizens, you know? And that's another thing I realized when I was in Ethiopia last time. And Tigrayans are, you know, maybe it's a little uncomfortable to be Tigrayan. I can understand that. They feel a little vulnerable because, you know, there are extremists. But the overwhelming feeling, the overwhelming sentiment of the Ethiopian people is to reach out to their Tigrayan neighbors and friends and show that the war is not going to divide us. You know, we have democracy to solve our political differences today. So yeah, a lot of what the TPLF accuses Ethiopia of is pure self-projections. It's because they have been doing it and much worse. So yeah, but somehow they managed to fool the West into latching on to this very simplistic interpretation of the war as tribal, as between Tigrayans, and to make people believe that there was this hate, and they used this very lazy, frankly paranoid comparison to Rwanda, with this relentless demonization of Ethiopia, you know, always believing the worst. You know, even we know the truth is the first victim of war, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like the media narrative has beaten the scholarship on Western Ethiopia policy. I've lived in Ethiopia for many years, so I know in every ethnic group there's a very small minority of fanatics. It's the same all over the world, isn't it?
Yeah.
But most people, they get along great, you know, and to the extent that this ethno-nationalist extremism is real and it's a real danger, that's just one more reason we should support the multi-ethnic coalition behind the federal government for all its flaws, you know. It has a Tigrayan Minister of Defense that's rarely acknowledged. And if anything, the Prime Minister has been accused of being naive, you know, of wanting to co-opt everyone. He's a compromise seeker. So I don't see any alternative. I really don't understand why they want to turn him into this villain, because it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe it's because of, go ahead, please.
You know, I think historians are going to wonder what went on, you know, how could they be so stupid? There's a lot to unpack there with the media sensationalism and how the narrative took over from the scholarship.
Right.
Yeah. Especially now when there is no genocide. There won't be any genocide. I hope there won't be. I mean, if there is an atrocity or something, I'm sure the Ethiopian government will clamp down and it will crack down and punish the perpetrators, because there's a lot of stake for Ethiopia too. Yeah.
Now, the government has this responsibility of ensuring law and order. That's exactly what it has been doing. That's a great point that you've raised. Going on from there, I'm sure that you are also familiar with this. So let me ask you this question. The delegation of the Ethiopian government has left for South Africa to hold peace negotiations under the auspices of the AU. I think this has exactly been what the government of Ethiopia is saying over and over again. Peaceful resolution, peaceful mechanism to the situations in the north.
Right.
Yeah, so the government obviously sees this as an opportunity to peacefully resolve issues in Ethiopia. What is your observation here? Tell me.
Right. Please. Well, it looks like the war's over, isn't it? It looks like the TPLF has lost, at least for now. But still, I mean, its whole legitimacy was based on the weapons. So, but I mean, talking is never going to do any harm. So, I mean, how the Ethiopian government should negotiate, I can't tell. I think they know the situation on the ground much better than I do, much better than my camera does, much better than anybody. So, yeah, I just trust them to negotiate the best way. I don't have any opinion on that. I just want to say clearly the crucial battle now is for public opinion in Tigray, to prevent a renewed insurgency and to make them embrace pluralism and democracy. It was very obvious that the offensive launched by the TPLF on the 24th of August was a last gasp offensive. I also tweeted that this was going to worsen their negotiating position. Of course, this is what happened. They've lost all the cities. The only bastion left seems to be certain misguided Western media and politicians.
So what is the clarion call, in your view, for Ethiopia and Africa as we speak, in the midst of all these challenges, media campaigns against Ethiopia, and of course, against the continent of Africa?
Yeah, I think Ethiopia, including myself, all of us, must learn from our mistakes in the media battles. Yeah, there were a lot of mistakes committed, especially in the beginning of the war. And we need to tell the good stories from Africa, not just sort of the grateful donor darling, but the vibrant societies full of progress and creativity, and also be careful with our sources. I mean, all the reports about airstrikes have been from TPLF sources. And again, the first casualty of war is the truth. So, footage coming from TPLF sources in Mekelle, anonymous aid workers, an unnamed diplomat, that's not good enough, especially when you make wild accusations that are very incendiary sometimes. But it's just taken at face value. There's Will Brown from the Daily Telegraph, for example. He wrote that allegedly there were reports that every Tigrayan in Addis Ababa was being rounded up into concentration camp and murdered. How can you write something this incendiary, this crazy, It's unbelievable, and no accountability for that afterwards. He could just have taken a plane to Addis Ababa, walk down the street, listen to Tigrayan music, talk to some Tigrayans in the street, the taxi driver, the shopkeeper, the hotel owner, but no, it's
simple as that.
Just narratives have consequences, and I'm sure that has prolonged and exacerbated the war. All these wrong narratives. I mean, if I put myself in the place of a sort of moderate Tigrayan who disbelieves the TPLF because they know they're authoritarian, but then hears that, oh no, there's a genocide. They hear it from The Economist, from CNN, from all these respectable Western media. They tend to believe it, and Westerners tend to believe it. Who can blame him? I might have believed it if I hadn't known Ethiopia well. I might have believed the propaganda. I doubt I would have been able to see through the propaganda if I hadn't known Ethiopia so well personally. Now, maybe I could also say, the thing about media sensationalism,
of course,
that we human beings, we are the storytelling animal, right? So a story about the hyena feeding on the dead bodies, that's always going to draw attention a lot more than a sort of serious analysis of the recent history of Ethiopia. Unfortunately, that's like that. If you're a young journalist, you want your big break, you want to win an award. You don't write a very long and serious analysis. There's no space for that. You write something sensational that resonates with the popular prejudice that people can latch onto. Unfortunately, that's a fact.
Yeah,
I don't know how to deal with that.
Absolutely.
But we should still be able, to not just zoom in and see these horrible things, but also zoom out and see the bigger picture sometimes.
So, what is your message to reporters covering issues on Ethiopia? As a Danish journalist, what kind of message can you convey to them?
I would say, take a fresher look at Ethiopia and Africa. Instead of always assuming the worst, instead of the same lazy comparison with Rwanda, immerse yourself into the Ethiopian society if you have the possibility. Nowadays, you can even use Google Translate to read local newspapers. Nobody does that.
Right.
And do not assume that these self-proclaimed experts are neutral. People like Kjetil Tronvoll, Martin Plo, Alex de Waal, who've stood ready to meet the demand for media sensationalism, and they have, boosted the false TPLF narrative about the dictatorial old guard being somehow representatives of an oppressed minority. But they've been wrong again and again in all their predictions. Like 1 year ago, Alex de Waal was predicting the breakup of Ethiopia, becoming like a loose confederation. Now he's predicting state failure. And all I have to say about this is I think it's very unlikely that Ethiopia will break up and have state failure. But if that were to happen, the Western powers would have a lot of blame, because I would have blamed them for tipping the scales. So I don't think that's not my prediction, I must say. I think Ethiopia will get through this.
Absolutely. Rasmus, thank you so much for your wonderful ideas.
You're very welcome. And if your readers, your listeners and viewers want to follow my work, they can just search on my name.
Yeah.
Rasmus Sonderriis plus Ethiopia, perhaps. And you can follow me on Twitter too. Rasmus
Sonderriis, writer and journalist. Thank you so much. Keep up the great job.
Thank you very much, Sifaran. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you as well for having been with us.